Hello, lords and ladies of the internet. I'm the King of Candor, and today I'm going to be talking about how you can world build with kobolds. So, I think step one to this is defining what a kobold is. I go into greater detail here in my History of Kobolds and Fantasy video, but the quick version is there's actually two versions of kobolds. The first kind of kobold is a mix between a goblin and a dwarf. These kobolds tend to live in mine shafts, and they either act as friendly guides helping people who are trapped or warning them of imminent collapse by knocking on the wall, or they are the reason that collapses happen, because these kobolds want to kill miners and take their treasure. There's a second version, which is much more popular in Dungeons & Dragons inspired media. They are small, draconically aligned pests. Now, all kobolds generally fall into one of these two categories. However, there's a lot of play between them. For example, if you look at kobolds that are in the goblin/dwarf group, you can see that a lot of depictions of them, they kind of look more rat-like, and many old Germanic depictions have them being way more humanoid. But a lot of the early fantasy has them with these rat faces as well. Now, what's really interesting is you can see how this was depicted in the original Dungeons & Dragons sets, first and second edition mostly. Any fantasy that came out inspired by these tend to have kobolds that look like this. This is why World of Warcraft has their kobolds look the way they do. WoW is based on the Warcraft RTS games, which predate the draconic shift in fantasy. They also love mining and have the little candle on their head as a callback to ancient Germanic folklore, which I find really fun. You know, take a candle. There's also a special subcategory of these rat-like kobolds that make them look more dog-like. In fact, this comes from a lot of early modules of Dungeons & Dragons describing them as being a mix between rats and dogs. This is how they were in the first two editions, which were both imported into Japan. The Japanese absolutely love Western fantasy, especially stuff that was imported around the 80s when American culture was greatly popular there. If you want more proof of that, go look at Fist of the North Star and how it is highly inspired by Mad Max or Studio Ghibli, who was trying to be Japanese Disney. So, these dog-like kobolds are the ones that they adopted, and it's why when you look at a lot of Japanese media, they have dog kobolds. Just a little fun side note. So, where did the lizard ones come from? They actually come from the 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons rewrite. You see, Wizards of the Coast bought Dungeons & Dragons from TSR and immediately launched a new edition that redid some of the lore and tried to tighten up some of the weird inconsistencies throughout the game. In order to make kobolds stand out from things like goblins, they wanted to make them draconically aligned and had them become dragon worshippers. Most modern fantasy is inspired by the 3rd edition of D&D, especially for things like the kobolds. The 3rd edition rewrite and all current editions of D&D have kobolds as dragons or lizard men who live in caves and are pests that need to be dealt with. This does create issues later on, where they add full dragonborn to their setting, and lizard men now have some strange questions around them. But we'll cover those when I eventually can make them their own videos. So now that you know a quick history about them, you can easily start to see just how versatile the kobolds are. Outside of being small in nature, physically weak, and not super civilized, they don't really have any features that are core to them. This is really exciting if you're trying to world build, because it gives you a lot of freedom to do whatever you want. However, it's also kind of scary because you don't really have something to play off of. There is no perfect, iconic, and well-respected kobold that you could point to as the definitive one. An example of a fantasy race that is something like that is the cat folk. I know there's going to be a lot of disagreement, but the best version of cat people in any fantasy is the Khajiit from Elder Scrolls. The Khajiit are super iconic, and basically are the perfect version of cat people. Any other cat person that you create is going to be compared to them automatically. Another group like this would be the Rat Men from Warhammer, the Skaven. Now, kobolds don't have this iconicness, so when world building for them, you can kind of slot them into any part of your setting that is lacking. For example, in my own setting of Enos, I have them as these small draconic guys who live in tribal bands. They have an absolute love for meat, and they're not very scrupulous about where it comes from. This means that less civilized kobolds do enjoy cannibalism. However, more civilized ones will often work for less pay if they have access to meat. I also wanted to have a small-sized race of lizard guys to go with my alligator men called the Boyan. You can ask me about the Boyan in my Discord, which is linked below. Otherwise, you'll have to wait for the eventual video on them. So, I use the kobolds to fill this gap in my setting. I also made them more clan-focused. They have an extreme sense of loyalty to the group. If you've earned their friendship, or they consider you part of their clan or family, they will die for you. This is what sets them apart from goblins morally. Both will kill indiscriminately and are terrorizing local farms if needed, but goblins in my setting are very selfish, whereas kobolds are very selfless. This does mean that due to their low intelligence, a lot of kobolds in my settings will get abused and wrapped up with evil villains, and because they are so loyal to them, they can't really be convinced out of it very easily. I also make the kobolds generally trying to be helpful, even if they don't help correctly. They will try to work with people, assuming they don't need something from them that's gained through hostility, and I feel this harkens back to their old roots as warnings for miners in Germany. Before we continue, if you like the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. So, how should you use kobolds in your own setting when world building? Honestly, for me, they're one of the last races I tend to add. I use them to fill the gaps. Otherwise, I think they should be used as some sort of off-the-beaten-path type encounter. You see this in their origins when they inhabit mines in something like World of Warcraft, where that is their base, and they attack people who intrude. Or they inhabit the ruins and worship a dragon, like in Dungeons & Dragons. In my own setting, I have said that they exist in the wilderness on the unexplored continents. The idea that kobolds live on the periphery and are one of the reasons you don't wander off alone seems to be a good spot for them in fantasy, and I'd pull on that string. I can imagine a setting where you have a giant megacity, the New York of fantasy worlds, and this city has a sprawling sewer system that goes underneath it. Of course, you have your traditional gelatinous cubes and rogue guilds, gelatinous cube video linked here by the way, and all other ne'er-do-wells who live in the sewers, but there are also rumors of kobolds. These sewer dwellers thrive off of things that are flushed down to them, and there's a saying in the city that if you drop something in the sewer, well, kobolds got it now. Maintenance crews and explorers often have to bring weapons and gifts to either fight off or placate these rapscallions. Another more fun twist you could use on kobolds is making them sort of like a more deadly version of the codename Kids Next Door. I could totally see kobolds using 2x4 technology and having a lot of the weird funky weapons that we saw in the show, but amped up because it's a fantasy world. A fart gun, a machine gun that shoots toenail clippings, a skunk on a stick, all these other weapons and the ilk like them could totally fit kobolds, and it's just free real estate. Something I haven't talked about much yet is their culture, and I think that is because it is really lacking in most other fantasy settings. That's why I created this idea of loyalty and community and meat around my kobolds, and I think that's the best way for people to use them too. This also makes the kobolds have interesting interactions with players and other factions, and will allow them to be more than just these psychopaths in the woods. Speaking of psychopaths in the woods though, my friend once ran a game where he used kobolds as Appalachian moonshiners basically. They all had West Virginian accents and straw hats and overalls, and instead of just hating the federal government based, they fought against whatever kingdom was in the area. They were very insular, but you could easily befriend them. They had some of the best alcohol in the setting, and nobles would pay a high price for such a pure strain of alcohol. The players were hired to go make trade deals with the kobolds, which led to a lot of fun shenanigans. Interactions like this, and stuff that has happened in my own home games, are why I think kobolds should be much friendlier and able to be negotiated with when compared to something like a goblin. However, don't get me wrong, kobolds are mean little bastards who will tear you limb from limb if you threaten them, and they always have escape plans and tactics. I know I mentioned in the other video, which is still linked below, but if you need inspiration for kobold fighting techniques, you should look up the story of Tucker's Kobolds. You know what, I'll have that linked below too, but the idea is that these kobolds are so vicious and mean that high-level parties are more afraid of them than the powerful monsters like vampires inside. They are a testament to how kobolds can be used incredibly effectively. You know, thinking about it, I suppose it could be a fun setting where kobolds are kind of like freedom fighters against a tyrannical government. You could use them basically as your setting's Viet Cong soldiers. That would be a lot of fun in a game. So, that is all for today. Thank you for watching this far. If you enjoyed the content, I'd appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. I'm looking forward to your candor in the comments below, and have a great day.